Bradley Pierce. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure. So you are with the one of the things you do many things, is you are with the Heritage Defense, and I was on their website watching their video, and they made a claim that over 30% of children will be in the U.S. will be involved in a CPS investigation before the age of 18. Is that really accurate?
Unfortunately, it is. Yeah, 37.4% of children, according to a study by the American Journal of Public Health, uh, said that's how what percentage of American children will be part of a CPS investigation by the time they turn 18. And you can check that also against the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They have data about how many children every year are involved in a CPS investigation, and we see it's over 4% of children in the U.S. every year. So you can see
Mm,
how over 18 years you can very easily get to 37%.
yeah.
Um, and some of those are multiple times, so that's why the number is not like 4 times 18. But yes, it's a huge issue that affects a whole lot of people in this country.
Now, is this something that has been happening for a while? Because I feel like CPS wasn't as big of a deal um, 10 or 20 years ago.
It has been happening for a while. These numbers have been consistent for quite a long time, and it's something that there didn't used to be actually CPS agencies. We had criminal laws, and if people committed crimes against children, then those people were justice was carried out against them, and then family, friends, church, and that sort of thing would help take care of the children, and there were various kind of non-governmental safety nets to help take care of children. But with with CPS now, we've created this kind of quasi criminal area of our law that you're
Mm,
not committing a crime, but you're doing something that we think is harmful to children, and so we're not going to punish the perpetrator by putting you in prison or any kind of penal sentencing for you, but we're just going to remove your children from you and put them with someone else until
mm.
you um, take the classes we want you to take or things like that. But um, yeah, but the actual numbers as far as the reports and the number involved and that sort of thing has stayed steady for at least the last couple of decades.
Wow. And the response from CPS is not to put the child abusers, if they are actual abusers, are they taken to court, or is this kind of a is it less of a legal process? And how does that all work out?
Yeah, it's still a legal process, but it's not handled, like a criminal situation would be. And in fact, in the U.S. Constitution and lots of state constitutions, there's lots of protections for criminal defendants that actually do not apply
Mm,
to parents in child protective services cases because they're not criminal defendants. And so in a lot of ways, criminal defendants get way more due process than parents do, who are not even being charged with a crime. They're just being charged with child abuse that's short of a crime or child neglect that's short of a crime.
yeah.
And so but yeah, it's still there's still a legal process. There's still most of the time it's district attorneys' offices, people who do prosecute crimes who are also bringing the CPS case into court. It's investigated by CPS agencies and then brought into court by prosecutors, and then you have judges, and yeah, still this you know legal process, but it looks very different, but it's the same system.
Yeah, and but the people who are abusing these children or neglecting these children, all they're asked to do is to go through some training courses, or surely that seems a bit ridiculous as far as the penalty inflicted.
Yeah, and it varies. There's if people are actually committing, criminal child abuse or criminal child neglect, then they're
Yeah,
subject to the same criminal system, right? They can go to jail, just like anybody else. Or if you abuse a child to death, you get the death penalty for
oh
that.
yeah, then you
So
get
we're not
yeah,
talking about like the criminal levels, right? But if you're doing something short of something criminal, then that's what we're talking about here. And as far as what the remedies are, they can be everything from permanent loss of your children, which is called a termination of parental rights, down to really just more of a hey, don't do that again, and everything in between, right? Where maybe you have to take classes, maybe you have to, if it's drug related, maybe you have to be drug free, take tests and be drug free for so long. And so, it just depends upon what the actual situation is, when there's an actual finding that abuse or neglect has occurred.
And that doesn't feel like a an out of place or a wrong thing. That I mean, that feels somewhat reasonable and even justified. Is there yeah, I don't really, see a problem in that. That kinda makes sense.
Well, one of the problems is the system major. The definitions of are very very broad as to
Mhm.
what is abuse and what is neglect, and it's subject to a lot of subjectivity. What does this mean? One thing that's required for to prosecute someone for a criminal offense is the criminal defense has to be offense has to be very specific, and it cannot be what the courts call unconstitutionally vague. You have to know that what you're doing. Not you don't have to know. I mean, ignorance of the law is not an excuse, but the law has to be clear.
Yeah.
But when it comes to CPS law, it can be very very vague, and so you may have something that one social worker thinks that something is abusive and one judge thinks something is abusive and another judge doesn't think it's abusive, so there's not clear definitions. So that's one of the problems and why there's an opportunity for a lot of abuse. Another problem is that you're actually not legally required to report most crimes, right? Like if you see a crime being committed by someone, you're not legally required to report that. Now, most
Right.
people do report crimes, especially
Yeah.
actual like assaults and murders and things like that. Maybe not all drug crimes, but most people do report crimes. But when it comes to anything involving children, even if it's not a crime, if it's just any kind of suspicion of child abuse or even child neglect, which is a much lower and more vague term, um, then people are legally required to report those things, or they can go to jail. They can lose their license to, be a counselor or be a doctor or a
Mm.
nurse, and they can be subject if the child is harmed. They could be subject to paying damages. So one of the
Hmm.
problems with that, since we've kind of deputized every person in the country, or at least every professional, um, now we have it ends up resulting in major over-reporting of child abuse and
Yeah.
neglect. And so the net effect of that is that about 91% of reports made to Child Protective Services in the U.S. are ultimately deemed unfounded by Child Protective Services themselves.
Hmm. And I feel like I would want my CPS agents. I guess we can talk in a second about like is the idea of CPS agents even one like a good idea that we should have or continue trying to promote. But if I granted the premise of we have CPS agents, I do feel like I would want them um, over reporting as over reporting more than I would want them under reporting. I feel like that's we'd rather be safe than sorry.
The problem is whenever it results in their resources being spent largely, investigating and dealing with innocent families, and then they don't have the resources to actually deal with families who actually are, abusing their children. That can be a
Mm,
big problem. And the other problem is now you have a lot of innocent families that are having to go through, very difficult, stressful, and traumatic
yeah.
investigations, and we're even seeing data that interviews of children by CPS are the interviews themselves are traumatizing to children, even when maybe the CPS investigator tries not to be.
Right.
If when you have a government agent who has the power to remove you coming into your home, and your parents are obviously nervous, and they're asking you questions in private about the intimate details of your life that you really don't share with anybody else, that's that's traumatic for children. And so
Yeah.
when you have major over-reporting, now you have a large number of children being, subjected to these interviews who don't need to be, and so you have CPS itself is causing harm to children in the very way that they conduct their investigations, and so you want to minimize that as much as you can.
Yeah, you do. And I would imagine that for a lot of these kids, this is for a lot of the parents, they're just like spanking their kids, or they're just disciplining their kids, or they're, just doing things that would be regular and unremarkable for 50 years ago. But because there's, a Karen next door who only has cats, they keep getting reported to CPS. Does that kind of thing happen, or is it just regularly? Um, yeah, I'll leave it there. Does that kinda thing even happen?
Yeah, that definitely happens. There's a whole range of cases that come up where people are either falsely reported or they're reported for something that just gets overblown, something very minor that parents maybe it's like, yeah, parent, you could have done a little bit better on that, but it's not child abuse,
Right.
but it gets way overblown by people sometimes, like you're talking about, people who don't have children of their own and they don't really know how to understand what it's like to be a parent and how to raise children. But then sometimes also you just because of mandatory reporting, you have a lot of people who just report even if they don't think there's anything going on. They just report because they just want to cover their own backsides. And so you have lots of hospitals and doctors' offices that have policies in place that if you have a child with child with more than one recent injury, it's an automatic report for a lot of places. Or if you have a child
Mm,
with a certain kind of fracture, a spiral fracture or oblique fracture, automatic report. Or if you have a child under 2 with a suspected head injury, that's an automatic report. Even if no one actually thinks that there was anything the parents did wrong, it just
right.
gets automatically reported to CPS in those situations. And so that's the kind of thing that mandatory reporting leads to is people just reporting willy nilly and just to cover themselves, not really worrying about the stress that it's going to cause that family.
Yeah, and, it seems like this is just run by a bunch of women, is maybe part of it. I mean, uh, my youngest brother injures himself regularly, in doing things that, sure, my father maybe provokes him, not in, like, a bad way, but like, "Hey, I bet you could do that," and then he's like, Yeah, I bet I could," and then he does it, and he injures himself, and then we have to be like, "Okay, hold up, we can't get CPS called on us," but that's just like, you're being a guy, and you go out and you do things, and you find out that you aren't, invincible, and then you get injured, and now you have to go explain that, but then there's this whole hesitancy about, like, how do we lie about this to the hospital because they might think that, oh, because, his toe is broken, because he went down the driveway on a scooter with no brakes, because my dad dared him to. Is that the kind of thing that CPS should be called for? Is that so? It feels like a very feminized system.
I mean, there certainly is, as a culture that we have kind of masculinized, a lot of things that helicopter parenting and
Yeah,
we have to put bubble wrap on everybody and make sure nobody ever gets hurt or does any or takes any risks or anything like
yeah,
that. Whereas obviously it's a masculine trait to take risks and to push yourself and to do those things. Those are things that we have been undervalued in our society, and those are the things that for children to learn, they have to be put in situations where there is some risk. They do have to learn those things, but a parent's job is to manage that risk, right? To make sure it's not not too risky, but
right.
children have to be put in situations and learn things. You've got to hit your thumb with a hammer. You know what I'm saying? And if you think your job as a parent is for your child never to get hurt, then all you're doing is delaying the hurt.
Yeah,
They're just
yep,
going to find out once they leave your home. Now they're going to be getting hurt all over the place because they never learned it in the controlled environment, in your household. And so that is something that, so again, sometimes CPS workers can be very, um, again, thinking that if you're putting your child in any kind of risk, that you're a bad parent, and sometimes that can be what the best parents do. Again,
Yeah.
with with limits.
With right, you let your kid hit their thumb with the hammer, but you don't let them play with a saw afterward. There's limits to this game.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just wonder how much of the problem with CPS is because the kind of people that they pull in are like the TSA phenomenon, of people who just kind of overbearing, clearly powerless in their own lives, and so they inflict their power on others. And probably, I would imagine many of these CPS people don't have kids, and so I would just wonder like how much of this problem is because of the kind of person that that kind of work inevitably attracts.
There's a whole range of CPS workers, but there are, I would say, that a large majority of them do not have children of their own, and you see that. And when you're
Mm,
dealing with one who does have children, a lot of times they're going to be way more reasonable and way more understanding. But one problem is that a lot of reason that a lot of people want to become a CPS social worker is because they were abused as a child, and now they want to see other
yeah,
children, protected from that abuse, and that's noble. That's a good
right.
goal, and but sometimes it can be like a hammer looking for a nail, or everything looks like a nail when you're a hammer. That you can see abuse all over the place, and that happens a lot.
Yeah. Is the let's this is all like granted the premise of a CPS part of the government. Is that something that even should exist? What's the right way? Like, because I feel like um, there's a good place for CPS and a not so great place for CPS, but I'm having a hard time drawing a line or putting together some sort of formula or framework that I can look at this through.
Right. You know, I mean, should the government be stepping in? Whenever people are recklessly endangering their children, or deliberately harming their children, or even like I said, recklessly or criminally negligently harming children. Yeah, absolutely. I think the government has
Yeah.
jurisdiction for that. I think where it becomes a problem is whenever we're not talking about crimes against children, we're talking about something nebulous that's not a crime,
Hmm.
and now we've given government agents the power to remove children based upon something that's not even a crime, and so
Right.
that's I think where it crosses the line from, okay, legitimate government function, legitimate government institution, or jurisdiction, into, hey, you know what? Not everybody has to parent the same way, and parents can have
Right.
a range of parenting philosophies and methods, and as long as they don't cross that line,
Yeah.
then why does the government have a role there? And that's not to mean, again, some people can be doing things that are sinful. The church could have a role to step in, and other family
Right.
members could have a
Exactly.
role to step in and admonish and things like that. But for the government to step in with what the Bible calls, the power of the sword, or the power to remove people's children and permanently terminate their parental rights, that's something that we should take very, very seriously, and it should be a pretty high bar before we do that.
Yeah, and part of the reason for that is because we don't believe that the right to parent comes from the state, and I would imagine that the state kind of does believe that, and that's kind of where some of the clash is.
Yeah, I mean, again, of course, the state is who is the state? But yes, there's certainly lots of people within the state, and people have heard videos and it takes a village and things like that people have said for a
Yeah,
long time. And again, there's always an element of truth to that. It's like, yes, we shouldn't be isolationists, and we do need to be part of community. And yes, you know, children are raised, are assisted. Their parents are assisted by others, in church, and grandparents and aunts and uncles and all this. But if we say it takes a village, and that means that the child belongs to the village, okay, no, that's a problem, because that's not what God says. God says that
Right.
children, are under the stewardship of their parents, and they should obey their parents. Yeah, that jurisdiction is not given to anyone else.
Yeah, 100%. And on top of that, these people, the TSA people, I would imagine, and I'd be curious to hear your take on this as well, that a lot of these TSA agents, they are um, worried that the actions they're seeing, which aren't neglect or abuse right now, eventually will lead there. And so they're kind of trying to prevent the
Right.
war before it started.
Right. Well, there's definitely a pre-crime aspect to all of this. So there's a movie, Minority Report. I
Mm,
wouldn't recommend watching it without filters,
yeah.
but it talks about pre-crime that in this dystopian world that they can read people's minds basically and know when crimes are going to be committed in advance, and they can show up and arrest people in advance. And that's kind of how CPS is on a lot of things. That it's not that they think that, well, you haven't harmed children, but you're on your way to doing it, right? It's not yet a crime, but it's a pre-crime. So we're going to step in here. And again, there's a, there's a lot of problems with that. We've dealt with, people claiming things like that throughout history, and there's a lot of abuses that come from that. And it can be used, um, it can be used, to take away people's rights, um, and that happens. And so yeah, so you have some of that with TSA as well, and sometimes, and again, I don't want to over, there's probably some great people in TSA. There's some great people in CPS,
Yep.
but there's definitely a mentality, or there can be a culture that is, like you've mentioned, like people who are not very good at governing themselves love to govern other people, and so you can certainly see that.
Yeah. What is the proper role and scope of CPS?
I think that the government's job should to provide criminal and civil justice, and so because CPS is kind of in this in between world, I think a lot of it isn't really a proper role of government. I think that, does the government have a part to play? If they're prosecuting a criminal and that criminal has, children that need to be cared for, to making sure that those children are properly placed with other family members or folks in the church or in the community or friends. Yeah, that makes, you go to arrest somebody, there's a child there. What do you do with the child? Yeah, you make sure they get somewhere else safe, and do a background check, make sure they're going to be taken care of. I think there's a role for that. But when the government starts to actually come in and say, "Hey, we don't like the way you're parenting. It's not criminal, but we just don't like the way you're doing it," yeah, that's whenever I think it becomes a problem.
Yeah, 100%. So it's a on the back end as opposed to a preemptive sort of justice. You know, you have abused or you have criminally neglected. Raise the bar for what is considered a problem that the government needs to address, and then don't try and jump the gun and address it ahead of time. Is that kind of what you're saying?
To some extent. Now, again, I think if you're committing crimes that lead to bigger crimes, right? You step in earlier,
True.
but
Yeah.
I do think that we what we don't see in some way, and this can be misinterpreted, so I want to be somewhat careful how I say it, but in some ways, it is not the government's job to protect people in the sense that to keep bad things from happening to people. Instead, the government's job is mostly retroactive. As far as when we're talking about civil and criminal justice, it's okay. Something bad has happened, so now we're stepping in to deal with it. Now, the way that the government is proactive in dealing with things is by passing laws, and then those laws then have penalties attached to them, and those laws then proactively teach people. They proactively then deter people from committing crimes in the first place, and then, but by enforcing it after the crime's been committed, that's then deterring other people, right? So, when you
Right.
have like,
Yep.
historically, public hangings and things like this, well, that has a deterrent effect, on society, and
Yeah.
that protects people from being, you know, victims of that same crime because it deters people from committing that crime. So
Right.
certainly that it's not that the goals, the government's only backwards looking, but I think if we go the other way and we say, well, no, no, the government's job is to protect people. Now you get what happened during COVID. Now you get an entire police state
Right.
where, oh, we need to protect you, from all crimes by stopping them from happening in advance. Now we need to protect it, and that leads to gun control and all sorts of other things. We need to
Yeah.
stop, stop you from ever getting sick, and that leads to forced vaccinations, forced masking, forced social distancing, forced, quarantining, whenever you're not even sick. That whenever if you the way I say it, if you say that the government's job is to protect people from harm, period, then you have to make government omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent in order to do that. And at that
Right.
point, you've now government's God, and that's what we're seeing more and more of. That's what people want, and because people are not exercising personal responsibility, um, they're inviting more government because people are not governing themselves.
Right. Yeah. And that is what they want. I think I was talking to Chad Jackson about this, and I think that the reason that people are so ready to hand over all of their rights and responsibilities to the government is because they believe that they live in Darwin's world and not God's world. And so, if you are just blind chance acting on matter, then and you live for your own pleasure, you live for your own happiness as kind of whoops, here we are. Well, I guess might as well enjoy the ride. Then it makes sense that you would try and offload as many of the really tough things to the government, to someone else. But if you believe that, as Christians do, we are made in God's image um, to fill the earth and subdue it, to have dominion over the earth and have and conquer the world for Christ, then you don't offload those difficult things. But I do think there's a and you don't offload those difficult things, not because you're some sort of masochistic weirdo, but because the hard things as well as the good things have been given to you by God for His glory. So I do think there's an abdication of the responsibility of doing the hard things that we have handed over to the government, and that's just permeated across America and kind of across the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody's looking for a savior. Everybody looks around at the world that we live in and they realize
Yeah,
something is wrong here, and they're looking for someone to save the world and save society and save them. And when you reject Christ, then you go looking for something else. And so, probably the number. I think I'm not the first one to say this, but I would say the chief religion in America is statism. That
yeah,
we look to the state and to government to save us. And we also, like you said, we're when you give up when you give up responsibility and you hand that over to somebody else, well, freedom and responsibility always go together, right? They're attached at the hip.
yeah,
You cannot have one without the other. You cannot have freedom without responsibility. And the only
yeah,
way to regain freedom is to take responsibility first, and then the freedom will follow. Not quickly, but it will follow. And that can be painful, that we live in. We can be taking responsibility and not seeing our freedoms come back to us as quickly as we'd like. And everybody else is over here enjoying these safety nets that our responsibility is paying for. And yet, yeah, we're not as free as we want to be, but we have to be willing to do the hard things and take responsibility if we ever want to get our freedoms back.
yep, 100%. And I think it's a good point that it's not just perhaps nihilistic, but that if you are looking for a savior and you have denied the transcendent that role, then the biggest thing on this earth, at least, is the government. And probably the government and or nature, and so there are probably people there are people who worship nature. But if you were just looking for something to worship that you can see and touch with your own eyes, then it makes sense that you go to the government because that is kind of the largest, most powerful thing visible to us here on Earth.
Right. Well, and we always think the problems with the world is other people, and so how can we
Yes.
control other people?
Yeah.
It's
Right.
not me. It's not my fault the world's the way it is. It's other
Yeah.
people, and so how can I control them? Well, let's get the government involved to do that.
Yeah, 100%. So as far as the CPS thing goes, you had made a point that it's not the government's job to protect us. Um, Qualifier on that, and tell me if you disagree, but I would imagine the qualifier on that is the government's job is to make sure that we're not, to keep the borders safe, to put up a fence. If you think of it like a school playground, you want to put up a fence so not just everyone can jump in. And then if there are kids that start beating up the other kids, then you kick those kids out, or you go discipline them. But in the sense that if you want to be free, you have to be brave. And so if you're a kid and you want to try to build a ramp for your tricycle and then jump off it, you're probably going to get injured. But that's not the government's job to protect you from that because uh, the best way to learn is the school of hard knocks. Would that be a correct way of kind of qualifying that statement?
I mean, again, I certainly think that I believe in border security. I believe in
Yeah. Right.
strict immigration, but that's a whole other conversation about all the problems with all that I'm sure we'd agree with. But but yes, if the government does have a role to play in national defense, and there is a way in which that is you can see that as, oh, that's the government protecting us. But even a lot of that historically was really done at the citizen level, through militias and things like that. And
Hmm.
but certainly today in the society that we have, yes, does the government have a role in protecting us in the sense of being a watchman on the wall and protecting the wall and who comes in and who goes out? Certainly.
Yeah, and not only protecting us, protecting the walls, but also if someone starts going around inside the walls and killing everyone, we should probably deal with that. And that's the would you
Absolutely.
put that up to the government's job, or would you put that up to some sort of militia's job? What would that look like?
Well, again, in that instance, you really have it's um, historically, as far as whose job it is to stop people who are actively engaged in a crime. Historically, that's going to be the citizenry, right? That's why people, citizens
Yeah,
defending themselves, right, in that moment,
right.
because again,
Yeah,
that's kind of what I'm talking about. Like government, for government to protect you, it has to be omnipresent and omniscient and omnipotent. Government is not your personal bodyguard; cannot travel everywhere with you to protect you. You don't want them to be. Some
right.
people do want them to be that, though. That's the problem. And so, so we have to take responsibility for, I'm going to protect me and my family, and I'm going to be part of protecting my church and my community and my neighborhood. Um, so that's where it needs to begin. And, and, that's where we really need to be protecting ourselves and not trusting the government to do that for us.
Yeah, and by that, do you mean that, like, if there's an active shooter, you're the one that goes and takes care of it, not the police? You don't, like, just wait for them, let them keep killing people and wait for the police. And I would imagine that's what you mean, and not like
Right.
um, you are the one that now is the arbiter of justice.
Correct. Yeah, I'm not talking about meting out justice, right? That's the role of the government. God's given that jurisdiction to the government. We are not to seek our own vengeance or be vigilantes at all.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, as far as stopping someone who's committing harm, right now, then yeah, we should all be doing that, and then bringing them to the proper authorities. But again, I'm talking about kind of in some ways a something that's very foreign to the where we are today in 2025 America today
Yeah.
we do have, lots of law enforcement agencies and things like that. Do we need to support them? Do we need to help them? And should they be enforcing the laws? Absolutely. Should we
Yeah.
need all of those things? No, because we should be taking way more responsibility for ourselves. But am I glad that we have those things? Should we be supporting those things and funding those things? Absolutely, yes. While we also start to show more responsibility ourselves as citizens.
And I would imagine that would actually decrease the amount of crime too, because generally criminals kind of look both ways before crossing the street. As far as if there's a cop around, they're not going to go shooting people. But if there is, if there's a bunch of citizens around and they know, like for instance, if you were in the state of Texas and you were kind of walking around a mall, you can kind of look around and be like, yeah, most of these people have guns and are ready to kill me. And so there's an internal inherent or an internal inhibitor against any sort of rash action like that. Not because there's so many police everywhere, but because there's so many citizens ready to defend themselves and their family with more vigor than the police actually would, because they have a very personal stake in it.
Right. Exactly. I mean, and I live here in Texas, and I was just talking
Okay,
with
there you
someone
go.
actually earlier today about this, that there was here maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there was a man walked into a church and pulled out a shotgun and started shooting, and I think he killed one person, maybe two. I think he injured a second. But before he got, within seconds, a member of the church had pulled out a pistol and taken him out.
Yeah,
And or there was another church shooting that happened also in Texas, and again, a guy, a couple houses down, heard it, grabbed his AR, went over there, and took the guy out. And so, we will never stop homicides and murders from happening in this world until Jesus comes, and we're
yeah,
free of sin. There will be people who will commit evil acts, but we need to take it, that's it's our responsibility as citizens, to take be responsible for our own protection. And so yeah, so you're going to see in a society like Texas, you're going to see a whole lot less of that. It's not going to be zero, but it's going to be a whole lot
right.
less of that, because people are ready to put a stop to it very quickly. The
Yeah,
only areas where you're going to continue to see it, unabated, are the areas that the government declares to be, gun-free zones, and that's where you see a lot of school shootings and things like that.
yeah. Or Australia last weekend. So,
Exactly.
and yeah, I think that drive to, um, I think that was a really good point you made, that you can't you can't stop everything. There's still going to be homicides because this is a broken world, and I would imagine that a lot of perhaps this plays into the CPS thing as well. The CPS conversation, that there are a lot of CPS agents who would like to save every single child from a parent who abuses or neglects or does really terrible, like legitimately terrible and criminal things to them. And, equally perhaps virtuous in their own eyes are the people who are advocating for gun control, because they really do want every person saved. And
Right.
they can't fathom a world, because I don't know, because death for them is the utter and final end. Then it makes sense you would kind of want to avoid that, not only for yourself but for anyone else. Um, no doubt there's some virtue in the madness, that they are just trying to keep everyone from death.
Right. Yeah, no, I think you've really hit it. Um, and that is that, again, I think it kind of goes back to the people are looking for a savior, right? They don't want death in this world. They don't want children harmed. Who does? And so they're looking for some kind of solution to that. But they don't realize, they're starting with the wrong view of humanity, of man and of women, and of what the real problem is. And the real problem is not, environmental or anything else. It's that we are sinful creatures. We have a sin nature, and that's what we have to deal with.
Yeah. Yep. how do you square the on the one hand, you want citizens to be taking more charge of their protection and actively stopping evil. How does that square with or fold into the conversation about stopping abortion?
Yeah, well, it's certainly it's it's hard to actually like stop someone who's committing an abortion. Typically, if one person is trying to murder some other person, right, then you can stop the person who's doing it by shooting them or somehow restraining them.
Right.
Um, in this, when it comes to abortion, there's that option is not really available
Yeah.
because the person who's doing the killing has the person, and typically has the person inside of them. And if if you if you shoot them to stop them, then you're killing the person you're trying to protect. So it
Yeah.
a very different approach to that, as far as a kind of a what's a citizen's role in kind of a self-defense or defensive third party situation, whenever the person is in the womb of the perpetrator. So that's where we really can't stop people from doing that in a physical way, right? As far as
Yeah.
exercising use of force and self defense, we really can't. There's not a use of force that we can really use that way. And so we do have to. Of course, we all have ways that we can help stop it by talking to them and preaching to them and
Right.
doing what we can to offer them what's appropriate and help and things like that. Um, but ultimately, kind of coming back to what I was talking about earlier, the number one way we can stop them is by deterring them with the law and with the penalties of the law,
Yeah.
and then enforcing that law, and then that law also teaching people, because a lot right now our laws are teaching people that it's okay to do that, and our laws need to teach the opposite.
Yeah, and there's no penalty for having an abortion, or at least for many of these people, not just in the sense that like you'll go to jail, not just that kind of penalty, but also the kind of like there's not even a moral penalty for these people. They wear it as a pride tag on their like a pin on their jacket that look, I've had 8 abortions. There isn't a moral penalty for these people either. It's kind of seen as a badge of honor that you've had 8 abortions, and look at you being so free and so magnanimous with your, your with your body that you are able to do this. And so, yeah, it's hard to create laws generally. I don't know if this is true. You've done a bunch of work in legal, so maybe you can provide some light on this. But I would imagine that laws generally flow from morality, and so the morality of America being what it is, aka abortion, is seen as some sort of badge of honor. Um, it would make sense that our laws reflect that morality.
I mean, certainly every law is a reflection of morality. And so when we have laws against things or laws for things, that reflects, what we value as a culture. And in this instance, yeah, because we have laws that in every state, it's not illegal for, for a woman to order abortion pills, possess abortion pills, take abortion pills, to murder their children, then that's a reflection of where we are morally as a society, that we do not value life in the womb. And we have the pro abortion side, which values a woman's autonomy to be able to even take the life of her own child, kind of a might makes right perspective. And then on even much of the pro life side, that that has said, well, hey, let's not criminalize the woman, right? That's how they would put it. I would say, no, everyone should be equally subject to the law.
Right.
Those who say no, she shouldn't, she's a victim, again reflects a morality of viewing humans as somehow not responsible for their own actions, not moral agents making their own decisions. And so all of that's a reflection of kind of our view of humanity. And so,
Yeah.
I believe that all humans are made in the image of God and are equally valuable and precious, right? That's why we should have laws that make it illegal to take someone's an innocent life. But then also all human beings, once they reach a certain age of maturity, are equally, are not equally, but are moral agents. And so, I mean, there's different levels of,
Yeah.
mental capacity and things like that. But just
Right.
speaking in general terms, we're all moral agents making our own decisions, and we should be responsible for those. And so, whenever we say no to both of those things, now we're devaluing the life of the child, and we're devaluing even the humanity of the mother when we say that no, we're not going to treat you like we treat all other human beings. We're going to
Hmm.
give you a free pass to do something that we wouldn't let anybody else do.
How much of the problem is from that? Because that's a I don't think I've heard that point before. That yeah, it would feel um, dehumanizing to be exempt from any law. It's almost like I've never actually seen the movie, but I've seen a review of it, American Psycho. And I think the premise of the movie is that he keeps killing people and receives no retribution from the law, and it's driving him insane. I wonder how much of the problem with I wonder if the women who have all these abortions are going through the same mental processes of I keep killing someone, because we know from the Bible that they know that this is killing someone, and at the same time they're thinking I'm not getting any sort of retribution or penalty from this.
Yeah, it could be. I haven't seen that movie, but it is kind of a crime and punishment. That when someone's done something wrong, then they have a natural. They should have a natural, guilt about it. That
Yeah.
again, unless someone is kind of the psychopath kind of level, which again, that someone can get to that point, right? We call that, someone could just be being hardened, or someone becoming so callous that they get to that point. People who abort, women who abort, or there's a whole spectrum there. Obviously, you have those who are shouting their abortions and wearing all kind of abortion gear and very pro-abortion. There's one lady who has an abortion channel, talks about abortions, and the name of it is Abortion Every Day. And it's like there's those, and then there's
Yeah.
those that do it and feel ashamed and they regret it and things like that. But sadly, one thing we're seeing in our society is that the latter group, those who feel ashamed of it, it seems to be less and less, and it's becoming way
Hmm.
more something that, like you described, people really are proud of, and that I think that reflects where we are as a culture, and it's not good.
Is that because the people who are in the "I still have a conscience" group, are transitioning into the pro-life movement, or because their conscience is being hardened and they're transitioning into the proud abortionist movement?
I don't know. It's I think some people, there's some people who just again, those who fight against God. The law is written on our hearts, like you referred to earlier, and
Yeah.
there are those who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, and there's some who suppress it more than others, and there's some who don't suppress it. They just do what they know it's wrong, and they don't suppress it. They just do it anyway because they feel like that it's the easy way out of a bad situation, and or what they feel is a bad situation. And
Uh,
so yeah, people have all kind of motives for that.
yeah. Um, is the solution to this problem to come top down from the law and to legislate morality, or is it the other way around, or should they meet in the middle?
I think it's a both and. Yeah, I think that that the phrase "you can't legislate morality" is one of those that's true depending on what you mean by it. It's false depending on what you mean by it. Right?
Yeah.
You cannot legislate morality in the sense that you cannot pass laws that will make people moral. There's no laws that will
Right.
make people
Right.
moral.
Yeah.
But if we're talking about, can you legislate morality in the sense that can you make laws based on moral standards, absolutely, all laws are. I mean, that's what laws are. They're someone
Right.
has made a moral determination and is now imposing it on others. That's what laws are. And so I think both, right? We see that, um, Scripture talks about Ecclesiastes 8:11. My paraphrase here, because a sentence against an evildoer is not carried out swiftly, the hearts of the sons of men is set within them to do evil. And
Hmm.
so God, God defines crimes and He defines penalties for those crimes. And when we do not carry those out, people are encouraged to commit crimes because there's nothing restraining them. There's no outside restraint. And
Yeah.
so we ultimately what we want for people is an internal restraint, right? We want the Holy Spirit. We want their love for God and for their neighbor to be what restrains them from doing evil. But that's not everybody, and
Right.
so for those who will not, who are not restrained internally, yes, we need to preach the gospel to them, but we need to restrain them externally, and that's what the law does. And the law is a way for us to love our preborn, in this case, love our preborn neighbors. But the law is a way for us to love our neighbors as ourselves, right? Do we want the laws restraining people from coming into our home, burglarizing our home, stealing our stuff, you know, committing sexual assault, murdering us? Do we want laws that restrain people from doing those things? Absolutely, yes. Well, then we should
Yeah.
want laws that restrain people from doing those things to other people, in this case, preborn people. And so
Right.
it's both. We need to be reaching people who are thinking about abortion, and reaching them with the truth and reaching them with help. And most of all, reaching them with the gospel. That will be what internally restrains them. But we also need to be restraining people with laws.
Yeah. How do we fold in the people who are not Christian yet, but still know inherently that this is wrong and kind of stand tentatively pro-life against the abortion movement?
Yeah, again, I think it's a reflection that, like Romans 1 says, law is written on people's hearts. They know something is right or wrong, especially if something as obvious as murder. And so, yes, we know that comes ultimately because we serve a God who values life and a
Yep.
God who has specific has declared specific penalties for murder, and we know that's where that comes from. But for someone who doesn't, yeah, they can still agree with us and still support legislation that does criminalize it, and but ultimately they're kind of they're borrowing from the Christian worldview whenever they do that.
Yeah. And is there a place for them at the table, at the pro-life discussion table, or are they? You're welcome to the movement, but not to the leadership.
I mean, I think ultimately all magistrates. So if we're talking about like political leaders, all magistrates are God's ministers of justice, as ministers of vengeance when it comes to those who do evil, and all of them, s- you know, whether they have a faith in Christ or not, whether they believe, whether they see themselves as his ministers or not, they are. And so they all have a duty there. And so whether they're doing it for the right reasons or not, they should still exercise their jurisdiction as God has commanded. And so certainly we support them doing that. We want them to do it the right things for the right reasons and support
Yeah.
abolition for the right reasons. But ultimately, it's are they obeying God? Are they doing their duty? That's what we're calling them to do. And yes, we want them to be doing it because they are obeying Christ, because they
Right.
love Him. Um,
Right.
but either way, they should be supporting it, and I certainly invite them to.
Yeah. 100%. How have you seen a shift in the past? Call it since Trump took over in 2016. Have you seen a shift in non-Christians towards the pro-life movement, or have they stayed somewhat apolitical on this topic?
I don't really have the data or enough observation really to say. It seems like both to me. It seems like we've seen non Christians There's the non-Christians that have, kind of see what's going on in society around them, and they see the insanity, and they see there's a problem. I think there's a lot of those who would then, that would lead them to being anti-abortion. Yeah, I even just in the past couple of weeks have talked to some people that would say that they are secular pro-life, that they are not Christians, but they are
Hmm.
against abortion, and they kind of root that in humanism or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Um, but then I think there's some of the other going the other direction as well. They're continuing down the Romans 1 road, as when you reject Christ, and he turns you over to your own debased mind, then that leads you to doing and approving of things that are evil,
Right.
great evils like this.
Yeah, it's always Christ or chaos, as Doug Wilson is fond of saying. And Lewis said in That Hideous Strength through Professor Dimble, he was making a point to his wife. He was like, the world's always coming to a point. Good things are always becoming better, and bad things are always becoming worse. And so it's always more Christ or more chaos. You can't really sit in
Right.
the middle, even if it is comfortable right now. So the as the Republican conservative movement continues to fold in people like gays for Trump or gays against groomers or secular pro life people or even, um, yeah, I think those are probably the biggest three groups. There's some transgenders for Trumps. I was going to add them. I don't know that they are big enough movement, and I don't know that they will last very long. But how should Christians, who are the moral bedrock of this movement, um, think about all of these clearly non-Christian groups, but also common grace groups being melded and meshed into the broad Republican movement?
Yeah, it's I think we cannot be pulling punches. I think it's because we can be Republicans, but we have to be Christians first. And so we
Right.
need to be preaching Christ. We need to be, as He's commanded us, teaching the nations to observe all that He's commanded. And we can't be saying, well, but don't talk about that issue because there's some people who vote like us who we want to keep voting like us, and so we don't want to run them off. So you can't come out against sodomy and or or this or that. Um,
Right.
no, I don't think so. I think to the contrary, I think we need to be much more bold in rooting all of our principles, political and otherwise, in Scripture, in Christ, in what He's commanded us, because that's the transcendent truth. If we're not building on that rock, then we're building on sand. We're not just conservatives because we think it's better for the world, although it is. We're conservatives if by that we mean like doing what God says. We're that because that's what God says to do. And so we have to be starting with that, and we have to be declaring that. We are not simply, higher power, faith based, Judeo Christian, everything else, and Christian. Like, no, we have to be Christians. We're Christians, and we do what we do because we're Christians. And yes, we believe that all other religions are false, and there's only one way to God, and we need to be preaching the gospel and the law that is the tutor that leads people to Christ. And that needs to be the root of everything that we do. And if we lose votes, then you know what? We can trust God with that. Um,
Hmm.
that said, should non-Christians be obeying Jesus? Yes. Should they be
Right.
voting the way that He says and supporting the things that He says? Yes.
Yeah.
And so I hope that they do, but more importantly than how they vote, I hope that they repent and come to Him.
Yeah. Certainly. And it's a great reminder that we are Christians first and Republicans are conservatives afterward. Um, at the same time, there is like if we do as we're taking back politics for Christ, um, I feel like we have to bring people along. I don't know how to I don't know how would you square that, the bringing people along, we're trying to uh, raise them up into maturity on this topic, and they won't come they will come along, but they won't come along as quickly, or
Right.
yeah, they won't come along as quickly if we are I don't know how to balance this, but they won't come
Right.
along as quickly if we are a hard wall of either you're with us or or you're against us. But I would put in some room for you are against us ideologically on many of the things the Bible says about sexuality and even the abortion question, but there is, you are still made in the image of God, and we're going to try and corral you into the correct beliefs, as opposed to just beating you over the head with a bat until you believe.
Yeah, certainly don't want to do that. But I think God uses non-Christians to do His will. We see
Right.
Joseph with Pharaoh, right? Joseph could serve faithfully under Pharaoh, someone who's not a Christian, but Joseph could continue to be a Christian, or Daniel under the leaders of Babylon, or many others. There's we read about centurion in the New Testament,
Yeah.
and Paul's jailer, who became a Christian, but he's serving non-Christians. Right? We can operate and it's even serve faithfully under non-Christians or within that kind of structure.
Right.
Um, but we don't do so by being ashamed of our Christianity or
100%.
by pulling punches or certainly not by doing things that are evil.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think in our society today, which is it's a ostensibly Christian society, right? Meaning that it is in name, it's nominally Christian, right? The majority of people in power in our country are professing Christians.
Right.
Yeah, that's one reason why we have to speak to them and call them to act like it, call them to act like Christians, because even more so, it's even more important for them because they're actually claiming to be something, and so it's even more important to hold them to the standard that they claim that they are following.
Yeah. And on top of that, uh, the weird thing there is like they're appealing to a very like the fact that there is a gays for Trump group, given that Trump has so many professing evangelicals in his cabinet is a very strange phenomenon, that I don't think we would have seen coming. Partly because homosexuals have always voted left; they've always drifted left, and so the transition to a gays for Trump movement is very strange. And yeah, I don't know how. Obviously, we want to stand tall in our Christian beliefs, but there has to. I would imagine that there is a room for, hey, you guys also, for whatever reason, seem to understand the basics of other parts of life. You don't want communism. And so, we can take you and use you sounds harsh, but, come to our side for that. And we'll try and turn you Christian while you're here.
I mean, again, I think that can they and should they vote for and support things that we also vote for and support?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Um, and so if that's what God uses, to to make there be enough votes to pass, abolition, abolishing abortion or whatever, yes, so be it. But I think what we have to be careful about is if we are going to the non-Christians and saying, like, we need you, please help us. We're willing to compromise in order to get you on
Mm,
board.
yeah.
That's where it's a problem. That's where,
Yep.
like, the Bible, scripture talks about, like, going to Egypt, for help. Um, well, we should trust God, trust God to be our help. And again, they can come to our aid, right? If they choose to, they come to support, and we can support the same things together, and we can fight against the same things together. And that's all well and good, but whenever we actually start seeking out help, you know, from them, and instead of from Christ, instead of from God, and we're going to the world to, hey, please save us. That's whenever I think it can become a problem, or
Hmm,
that's when it is a problem. And so, I think we have
interesting.
to. And again, I think what the way that it works is, we should do God's will, God's ways, and then there'll be plenty of people who are not Christians who will agree with us and will come alongside us.
Right, yeah,
We're doing it because we're Christians. They can be doing it for lots of other reasons, and come along, and just like in the military, right? If there's an invasion of this country, we're going to be fighting along, fighting to defend this country alongside a whole bunch of other people who are not Christians.
right.
Um, but I can be doing it, as a Christian for Christian reasons and in Christian ways, and I can be requiring them to do that too, to the extent that we have that authority. Um, but we can all be fighting against the same enemy.
Yeah, and at the same time, like, if you look at the story of Joseph and Mary, they were told by God to go to Egypt for, safety and for, that they were told to
Right,
to Egypt by God for safety because Egypt was better than living under Herod, and so are they, did they trust in God? Yes, and that's why they went to Egypt, which is someplace they probably would not have gone without a word from the Lord.
right.
And so the question is kind of, is there a similar thing for Christians where if the if a certain group is standing up for the right things, um, gays against groomers, are we allowed as Christians? What should be our thought process around joining in with them, clearly against the gay part of it, but also for the anti-groomer part of it?
I guess it depends on what level of alliance we're talking about. If we have to in any way, um, you know, um, do anything that's going to give any kind of stamp of approval to them and legitimize, being gay, sodomy or anything
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that, then we cannot do that. If that's the price of their vote, then we can't pay that.
right.
But should we go, if we're door knocking, for candidates? Should we go to their house too and say, "Hey, vote for so and so"? Yeah, sure, absolutely. So again, it just kind of depends on how close are we talking about the alliances, and what do we have to do in order to get that support?
Yeah. Is this kind of a question of the difference between uh, allies and comrades or something like
Co-belligerence.
that? Yeah,
Yeah.
co-belligerents.
Yeah, I think so. I think it definitely can be.
This also folds into the question about you were up here in Moscow a month ago, maybe more than that, to debate Smash Mouth incrementalism versus abolitionism. And I fall in the Smash Mouth incrementalism side, but I think that is um, probably that connects to this conversation because we're kind of talking about what is the proper way for Christians to operate in a pagan world and to use some of the organizations, use some of the power structures that exist to bring about our means, while at the same time not defiling our consciences and not disobeying God.
Right. I think it can look different on different things. Some things God has spoken to extremely directly about exactly how He would have us handle them. Other things not as directly. So it kind of depends on what we're talking about. Um, and again, it also kind of depends on how we view our society. Do we view our society as one that's run by professing Christians who just need to be um, taught properly, or do we see that our society is a completely pagan government, and we're operating within
Right.
that?
Yeah.
And so I think it can kind of depend. I think on the abortion issue, what we're talking about By and large, a lot of it is we're talking about states that are pro-life, that are the vast majority of the people in power are professing Christians. And what should they be doing? Well, they should be doing, I mean, and as everyone should be, exactly what God says to do about this. That is
Yeah.
criminalizing it as murder. Equal protection for everyone. Everyone's equally subject to the law, and no one gets a license to kill. And that should be what we're doing. And anything that's short of that is really just as, and I'm oversimplifying, but is really normally it's just meant as a substitute in order to not to do what God says to do.
Hmm.
It's a way to avoid doing what He says to do.
Expound more on that, because I think there's still some darkness in the corners we got to light up and make sure.
Yeah. So if you have, let's say you have a state that, again, most of the leaders profess to be Christians, and I'm saying this should be everywhere, but especially in a state like that. Well, God says exactly what to do about this, and if you have majority, Republicans, and again, almost all Republicans in a lot of states are professing Christians, then this should be very easy to pass a bill of abolition that just says, hey, we protect, the same laws protecting the lives of born people should protect the lives of preborn people. Oh, of
Yeah.
course.
Right.
But we don't have the votes for that. And so instead of going
Hmm.
and exposing the so-called Christians who oppose that, who oppose equal protection, not that I'm saying, someone who opposes it is inherently a non-Christian, but they're
Right.
certainly
Yeah.
not acting as a Christian in that
Yeah.
sense. But instead of going and exposing them for that, we instead go to them and say, okay, well, what bill can we write that you would support? Even you're against doing what God says to do, so instead of forcing you to come out and to expose yourself and vote against it and let everybody see that you oppose what God says, instead we're going to go to you and say, what would you vote for? And now we're going to fashion our policy around that instead of what God says.
Hmm. Is that something that is just trying to get is that something that is meant to stand in as a replacement, or can you do both at once? Can you try and um, bring along the nominal Christians who, for whatever reason, cowardice or poor teaching, whatever it is, are not doing the things that clearly God has told them to do, aka outlaw abortion, um, at the same time going out and trying to take as much ground as possible, um, while in the meantime.
I think you can. And again, like I said, it kind of depends on the issue that we're talking about. I think on this particular issue, God has spoken so directly and so clearly. And even when he first institutes civil government, the very first duty he gives is whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. So this is the very
Mm.
central
Yeah,
function of government. So when we're talking about something this central, where God's spoken so explicitly multiple times, I think that when we talk about like doing other things that gain ground, unfortunately, we're actually losing ground when we do. We're actually the ones giving up ground
mm,
whenever we do those things, and we're legitimizing unbiblical positions. When we show, because abortion is ultimately about, or the legalization of abortion is ultimately about partiality. That is
hmm,
right.
yep,
A born person, I want laws that make it illegal for people to murder me, right? And I want those equally subject to everybody. I don't want anybody having a license to kill me. But I'm okay with there being laws that someone has a license to kill a preborn child and that they're not subject to the law. So that baby is not equally protected as I am. Right that's partiality, right? Laws for me, but not for thee, right? So the
yeah,
discrimination. So now that's partiality. Well, you don't beat partiality with more partiality. You don't overcome partiality with partiality. Two wrongs don't make a right. You just get more wrong. And so whenever you're introducing and you're supporting legislation that shows partiality, then you're just going to get more partiality. You're not actually gaining ground. You're giving every time you do that, you're legitimizing the ground that the pro-abortion movement is standing on, which is, hey, we think laws for me, but not for these children. And we're saying,
Hmm.
yes, we disagree about where the line is, but we agree that partiality is okay and legitimate. And so that whenever you support legislation that does that, you're undermining your own arguments. And so
But can't you?
that's then there's many more reasons, but that's a big one.
Yeah, but can't you not be legitimizing their reasons? While at this, like, can't you be putting together laws that that eliminate abortion as an option on the table, and at the same time, right? So you're not losing ground, but you're not uh, gaining all the ground at once. I don't. I
Yeah,
don't know
and
how.
I'm okay with I'm okay with taking a little bit of ground at a time. But what I'm not okay with is number one, doing something God forbids, which God forbids showing partiality. So I don't
Right.
think we should do that. Um, and then I think also when God's given us a clear command about what we're to do, then that's what we're to do. And so I'm
Right.
okay gaining the ground. Like, all right, let's get let's convince this legislator, then this legislator, then this legislator, or this organization, this city, this county, this state, this country. I'm all for gaining ground 1 yard at a
Yeah.
time. Absolutely, that's we have to. That's the way that we're
Right.
chronological, time space bound beings, and so absolutely. But when we're compromising, when we're doing something God forbids, or when we're compromising principles, or when we're legitimizing the very things that have gotten into this mess in the first place, that's where there's a problem.
How can you explain the legitimizing thing? Because if I put together a bill that says, okay, instead of the cutoff for abortion being after being 3 months, it's now 2 months. Um, how is that? I feel like I can do that without legitimizing the murder of the child, but I'm just taking a step forward as opposed to just trying to take a huge leap forward.
Yeah, I mean, you're inherently voting and supporting a bill that's dehumanizing human beings. Now, you may
Mm,
be shifting the line slightly, but you're still supporting dehumanization,
yeah.
and so that's where the problem is. And so I think a lot of times what we get to is, and here's the other thing, like putting aside the principles for a moment, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Like it just everybody talks about it like, hey, let's just if we do this, it'll work. It's like, guys, this has been 52 years in the pro-life movement that you've been saying this is going to work, and we're perhaps further than ever, away from abolishing abortion than we have been,
Hmm.
and so we've overturned Roe versus Wade, which is
Yeah.
hey, I'm glad that's gone, but there's more abortions now than there were even in the year we overturned Roe versus Wade, than there were
Right.
even 10 years ago, even 15 years ago. And so
Yeah.
we're going the wrong direction. And we're seeing the National Republican Party cares less about abortion than it did 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
The National Republican Party platform says less about abortion than it did 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think this whole idea of, hey, we'll just get ground and look at all this ground that we've gained, is really a myth. Yes, we've passed
Mm.
lots of bills, but I thought the purpose was to get closer to abolishing abortion and to save lives. But there's
Yeah.
more dying than ever, and it seems like our actual culture and even our political parties are less passionate about abolishing it than ever. So it doesn't seem
Yeah.
like we're winning.
I will absolutely agree that the secularization of the national conservative movement has had huge impacts, huge detrimental impacts on our ability to fight this problem, and also the problems of homosexuality. The Republican Party has kind of just become the moderate party, the moderate and secular party. And eventually, if that will eventually fall apart because you need the Christian framework to stand on top of. You need that the foundation of Christ. Otherwise, you're just always going to collapse into lunacy. And I will also, but I, and as far as the amount of babies being aborted, absolutely, there are more being aborted now, but I don't know that that's the government's fault. I would think more that that is the people's fault for aborting their children, not because there were more law, there were less laws inhibiting them, but just because we the moral structures that were inhibitions against or were walls, bulwarks against abortions have collapsed, and many of the kind of cultural expectations have fallen apart and changed, and now there's an expectation that if you're 20 years old and you're in college and you get pregnant, then of course you're going to abort the child. But I don't know that that's the government's fault. I think that that is something that can be fixed by preaching the word to them. But I don't, yeah, I don't know that I would tie that back to the government.
Well, it's a both and my main point was for those who say, "Hey, let's gain ground a little at a time, and then come back and get more ground and more ground." Again, I agree with that as a premise, but I don't agree with doing it the way it's being done.
Mm,
And I think you know a tree by its fruits, and we can look at that that mentality of like, okay, well, let's just compromise, 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 but we're doing so in order to gain ground. Um, that has been the strategy for 52 years,
mm,
and we've passed well over 1,000 abortion regulations across the country. I forget the exact number, but it's well over 1,000, and
mm,
yet what's it doing? And so that's my point when it comes to, are these things actually working? Because everybody says, oh, they're working, well, we're saving babies and things like that, and that's what we mean. Like, how do you measure gaining ground? Right, all the ways that
mm.
I would measure gaining ground, we're losing ground, and so what you're doing is not definitely not working by all the measures that I would use.
Do we know if the amount or the population density of abortion is um, the statistics on abortion are that it's kind of localizing itself and blowing up in that locality. Like, for instance, Idaho, where I live, has passed a bunch of abortion laws, and I think we've seen abortion go down. I might be wrong on that, but I would imagine that in California, abortion has gone up, partly as some of the people from Idaho or other conservative states around go to California for their abortions. And so, in that way, the abortion numbers are rising, but where the abortions are happening is indicating that something is going correct in places like Idaho. Do we have any data on that? I don't actually know.
We do, and so it depends on the states that we're talking about. So there's some states that have passed, bans on abortion clinics, and abortion numbers happening in that state have gone down some. Now they haven't gone down to the extent that most people say that they have, um, and the numbers of abortions happening in those states is actually rising, even it happening in the states. But yeah, the abortion travel is what we call that, right? When people leave their state, go to another state, get an abortion, and then come back.
Yeah.
That's called abortion travel. That has certainly increased, but we're actually seeing that decreasing now because more
Hmm.
and more people are realizing that they don't have to travel out of state. They can order the pill and do it in their own state. And so we're
Hmm.
actually seeing the abortion travel going down. And it's actually very interesting. You look at even before Roe versus Wade, you look at a state like California, like New York, like Illinois, um, and abortion numbers there were, they obviously weren't passing pro-life laws, pro-life bills, but you had other states, Texas, Oklahoma, other states that were passing pro-life laws, and it was interesting that the abortion numbers and rates were actually going down faster in many of the liberal states than they were in the pro-life states,
Hmm.
which I think you can see that they were going down not because of the pro-life laws, Because if they're going down, if that's the reason, then why are they going down to New York and not just New York? Why are they going down to New York City? And and so I think there's lots of other reasons why they're going down, why they were going down, but but overall, right now we're seeing them going up.
Fascinating. Have we seen examples of um, abolitionism working well?
Well, I mean, we're certainly seeing progress being made, but as far as abolitionist laws working well, none of those have been passed yet, for several reasons. There's some states where they've been introduced where they're pro-abortion states, so they're not passing there, and of course they're not passing pro-life laws either. But
Right.
then the states where, the so-called pro-life states, where they are being introduced, they're being killed by pro-life leadership, pro-life politicians, pro-life organizations in
Yeah,
those
that is
states.
weird.
So they're not getting a chance, for us to see what happens when you pass one of those. That remains to be seen.
Why is it that so many of the pro-life, congressmen, senators, government representatives, and sometimes even influencers are shooting down these abolitionist laws?
I think I've run into a few different motivations. I'm sure there's many more. Some of them are very self-preservation, that hey, we oppose this bill
Oh,
because
interesting.
this is too extreme and our organization is going to lose power, because you know this is just too extreme right now. And so
Mm,
yes, I agree, we should eventually get here, but we can't be seen supporting this or else we're going to lose influence. There's other
mm.
people who say, well, I mean, if we abolish abortion, then our organization would cease to exist, and so we can't do that. Again, that. I don't think. Hopefully, that's not the majority, but I'm almost sure there's some of those out there that I've
That's a
encountered.
terrible motivation.
It is, probably the most, I guess the most, um, I guess, easy to understand explanation for why people do that, oppose abolition bills, is they say, well, I support this in principle, but if we pass this bill, then the Republicans are going to lose the next election, and then the Democrats are going to win, and they're just going to undo it, and it's going to be worse than ever.
Hmm.
That's probably the strongest argument against passing an abolition bill. The problem with the argument is, first of all, that's God says to obey Him, and then we trust Him with the results. Right? We don't
Yeah.
say, God, we can't go in the promised land. You've commanded us to, but we can't because, have you seen those people? They're like giants in there. We're like grasshoppers. They're going to squash us like bugs. We're just going to lose, God. We can't do what you say. So we're really limiting God. We're walking by sight and not by faith when we do that. The other problem with it is that it's just not true. I mean, we're seeing a lot of the states that have passed pro-abortion laws, um, that had trigger bans that went into effect even after Roe versus Wade. A lot of people thought it'd be a political bloodbath there for Republicans, and it really hasn't been. I mean, the Republicans have held on in most of those states and even gained ground, like in the last presidential election. And many of the
Hmm.
state legislatures are more Republican even. And so, and the legislators that have introduced abolition bills, almost all of them get reelected. Yes, people come after them, but whenever they explain it to their constituents, most pro life primary voter is like, yeah, that makes sense. I thought that's what all pro lifers believed,
Yeah.
and so it's not a loser issue, and so
Yeah.
but those are some of the motivations that we run into about why people oppose, and then there's just the people who just, and again, this is a big contingent that they just believe that women who get abortions are victims and should not be subject to the law the same way as everybody else, and they're just kind of um, showing partiality and really in a
Yeah.
discriminatory way,
Corrupt in that way.
right?
Yeah. I'm all for, I don't know if by any means necessary, but pretty close as far as let's kill this thing and eliminate it as an option for these women. Um, I I guess my biggest thing, and if abolitionism is working better than the slow incremental movement, for whatever reason, and probably because it's hard over the long term to slowly push for something that you can't really see the goal, or you can't really see the end point of. It's much easier to like, here's a bill that just wipes the slate, and that'll just eliminate the problem. That's a lot easier than like the long retakeover of the government institutions. But I guess my biggest thought on this is, when God saves a person, they don't go from like drug addict living in a dumpster to um, St. Paul, right? There's a long time in between those, and usually they die somewhere along that line, and then later they're converted to St. Paul. Sometimes you go from Paul, who hated the Christians and was on his way to kill them, to becomes the like the one of the greatest apostles uh, ever.
Right.
And but
And I
most of the
definitely
time it's just kind of a long shift, and it's much harder because you kind of have to keep that goal in mind and walk by faith and not by sight. But that's just generally how I see God work in the world.
and that's you know what, I completely agree. I just have it. I take it. Let's come back to that example, right? I believe? I mean, I believe that sanctification is a progress with people and with nations. And so, what we do with people, right, when they become saved, and we come to them and we talk to them about their sins, we don't say, "All right, Joe, you're committing adultery. Now you're a Christian. You shouldn't. So here's what you should do, Joe. Only do it on Tuesdays, or only do it with women between this age and this age,
Right.
or just do it in this facility, or make sure you have a license to do that, or make sure you have a condom before you do that." But that's what the pro-life bills are doing, right? That's how the
Mm,
pro-life bills treat abortion. Now, what we do to Joe is we go to Joe and we say, Joe, that is sin. You need to completely abolish it, right? Completely eliminate adultery, right? No more adultery, in your life, Joe. And you need to repent of that, and you need to completely eliminate that. And then from there, Joe, then now eliminate it from not just your outward, now from your inward, right? And okay, now Joe, not just adultery. Now let's go to this issue. Now this issue. Now this issue.
yeah.
And I think that's how we should approach. I think that's again, I just apply it differently than you, but I think exactly the same thing. That it is a progressive sanctification as a nation, just like a person, and we go from one issue to another. But what we don't do is we don't go to an issue and say, "Hey, let's regulate just the circumstances of that sin." No, instead we abolish that sin. We
Yeah.
repent of it.
Yeah. And perhaps it's different slightly when a person gets converted. Um, Yeah, it's a good point. I'm also thinking in the back of my mind about something like the issue of slavery. Um, Clearly, the Bible doesn't want that. Clearly, that's not the ideal. And yet, there was a smash mouth incrementalist framework that was taken to abolish that, as opposed to an abolitionist. Yeah, once again, I stand here saying pretty much by any means necessary, let's kill this thing. And I generally prefer the like, let's see if we can slowly chip away and bring these people over. But if the abolitionism is working better, and there's verifiable proof of that, and it's working better over the long term as well, then hey, let's go for that. So I think that's probably where a lot of Christians stand on this topic as well.
Yeah, and I'm definitely for the let's slowly chip away, thing. That's what we're trying to do. But what we don't want to do is, do things that God forbids, or do things that undermine our own cause. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. One last topic I want to hit, and this is kind of something that has been in a lot of people's minds probably since the death of Irina Zarutska, the Ukrainian girl,
Right.
on the metro in Charlotte, North Carolina. There's seems to have been in America a complete rot and corruption of the legal system, and we're just now seeing those effects. I mean, that guy had been arrested like 48 times before, and then re-released again and again and again. And so I think a lot of people are kind of looking around going, "Hey, what happened to our legal system that that's being allowed?"
Yeah. Well, a few things are happening. I say that at its root, what's happening is that we have undermined the foundations of our legal system. So our legal system in the West is built upon Scripture. It's called the common law. It's where judges took Scripture, took the Bible, and said, okay, how do we apply this to these different situations through various case law? That's called the common law. It's built, built on Scripture, built on the Bible, and that's really the foundation that when we came over to this country, right, we adopted that. We adopted that wholesale into most states' laws, but we've largely abandoned that, and we no longer say that that's really the foundation of our law. So we're seeing it. We're seeing the effects of the last couple of centuries of undermining that.
Hmm,
Um, but things take time. Decay takes time. Rome wasn't built in a day, and Rome didn't decay in a day either.
right.
And so, one thing that we're also seeing, and I was in law school 21 years ago is when I started law school, and I remember I was in a criminal law. First of all, most of my classes, like contracts and property, and even a lot of criminal law. I remember sitting in class just thinking, this is straight out of the Bible, right? So much of what we're talking about is like this is straight out of Scripture. This comes from straight out of the Bible, and but I remember in criminal law one day the professor told us that the modern criminal justice system today, he said it used to be based on retribution, right? That is like an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right? Retributive justice. Um, but today our criminal justice system is built on the philosophy of rehabilitation. That is,
Hmm,
that we have to rehabilitate people back into society rather than punishing people. We really just need to change people. That's in fact, that's probably the best way to put it. The goal of the criminal justice system is not to punish people; is to change people. And fundamentally, that is an unchristian view of humanity. Uh, that's viewing humanity as merely a product of their environment, product of our circumstances. That person just committed that crime because of their environment, their past. Well, they were abused and hurt people, and
yeah,
so if we can just rehabilitate them and make them feel more self-esteem and give them a leg up and give them a college degree and all this stuff, get them a therapist, then we can somehow change them, and we can be their savior, and we can make them into these new creations. um, but that's not how it works. We can't do that. We don't have the power to do that. And so, what we've denied is doing what God says to do about it, right? God says, you commit this crime, this is the sentence. You commit this crime, this is the sentence. And God says, how we should carry those out. And
yeah,
so whenever we reject that and we say, no, 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 we know better than you, God. And man's not basically sinful, and man's basically good if we can just give him the right therapist, then
education.
that's how we end up with that situation where someone who committed crime after crime after crime after crime, and we were trying to rehabilitate him, and if we just give him a little more time, he's gonna be a great member of society. That's how you get that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Where did the shift happen from retribution to rehabilitation?
I think it really began with Darwinian, evolutionary view of
Mm,
humanity, and thinking that okay, if we deny, the creation and the creation account and original sin and things like that, if we see, oh well, we're just evolving, and so we just need to get further along in the evolution process. So we just need to help people evolve better. I think that's where we started to see that, and so we started to see a lot of the law schools around the country adopting a lot of Darwinian views, even in the teaching of law, and really viewing law not as a um, stewardship to do what God commands and to be His ministers of justice, but instead viewing law and government as what some would call positive law. Law is not meant to be applied, in obedience to God as His ministers. Instead, law is a tool to shape societies and people by
mm,
create the right incentives, create the right disincentives, and that's how you shape societies, and that's how you advance us along the evolutionary spectrum. I think that's where a lot of that came from, and we're still feeling it and perpetuating it today.
interesting. And does that kind of exist across the board? Because there are still a lot of judges who are trying to. It seems like at the Supreme Court level, they're like oftentimes the justice is more biblical than it is at kind of the lower levels.
I'm not fully understanding your question. Um,
Yeah. So at the Supreme Court level, you have things like they overturn Roe versus Wade, or they what are some of the other ones? Dobbs versus Jackson, was that recently overturned as well? Should really know this.
that was the case that overturned Roe versus Wade was Dobbs
That was
versus
the case. There you go. But they kind of they make, I don't know. It feels like the whole justice system below the Supreme Court is flawed, but the Supreme Court still is some kind of barrier against that. But I don't even know, um, is that true, or is that just a maybe a feeling that we have, that a hope that we still have some legitimacy in our legal system.
It's that you're kind of getting into a lot of basically the problems that we're talking about here exist throughout the legal system, at different degrees, in different places, right? In some states they're going to be better than others, in some states worse. In the federal system they're going to be worse, but in some federal circuits they're better than others. In the DC circuit it's going to be, one of the worst, and a lot of the cases that we're hearing about these days about like immigration and things like that go through the DC circuit, and so that's where we're hearing about a lot of bad stuff. So it's affecting everywhere, but it's certainly to a different degree everywhere.
Yeah. How how should we as Christians think about reforming and redeeming the courts in our land?
Yeah, well, I think we need to, and this is something that's a passion of mine, is seeing more young men aspiring to go into law and into practicing law. And I'm certainly in full support and full agreement with those who say, well, we need to get more people into trades, and stop thinking that everybody needs to go to college, and not everybody needs to go to college, and I'm in full agreement with all of that.
Yeah.
But not if that means that we're abandoning spheres, right? Yes. Should we have more Christians, more blue collar Christians? Yes. Should we have more white collar Christians? Yes. Um,
Also,
so,
yes.
also, yes, just more Christians everywhere. So I hope that there are more Christian young men who are thinking and being called by God into the practice of law, because we need them, and I hope that they see how much of our society is affected by lawyers and judges, who are lawyers. and how important it is to have the right people in those positions. And one reason that we're not we're seeing some corruption at those levels is that there aren't enough Christians, and there aren't enough Christians who are ruling as Christians, right? And who have a Christian worldview in those positions. And so we need a lot more of that. And so, if you know of any young men who are interested in that and talking to somebody about that, finding out how to go that route, have them come talk to me. That's what when I was 16 years old is when I really felt God leading me to the practice of law, and I love it, and I hope a whole lot more Christian young men who will practice as Christians would be called to that.
Yes, absolutely. And at the same time, maybe it's just in the South, but every time, I think it is just in the South. Every time I go like down south, there are every billboard is like, "Would you like to sue someone? Call me." Um, uh, and I don't know why. Maybe this is just a Southern thing. Maybe it happens up here in the North or, over in California, and we just don't promote it as much. But there seems to be, it's commonly known that America is the land of lawsuits. I don't know why we have such an obsession with fixing our problems by means of suing the other person.
Well, I'm not sure if it's geographically, I know the billboards you're talking about. There's certainly some around here, and if you go to some of the deep South states, there's like two or three law firms that they're like the Buckies of
Yeah.
of lawyers that have like billboards every mile or something. So I know exactly what you're talking about. I think that we live in a very litigious society, and some of this is good. Some of the suing people is good. Some of that's good, and some of it's bad. Um, what's bad is that we have a lot more people who are committing, acts of negligence and harming one another.
Yeah.
We have more of that going on, and then we also have people, who are less willing to settle cases, um, which we should be doing. And so those things are bad, and there's a whole lot of other reasons, that go behind all of that. But then the other thing is that lawsuits are actually the best way to enforce most laws. And so we should like
Mm,
uh, you know you know the best way to enforce laws is really through private attorneys and private plaintiffs, right? People who are injured
mm.
actually going and suing. It's way better than government regulators doing it. It's
Yeah.
going to be way more effective. It's going to be way more just. There's going to be way less like picking and choosing who you go against. And so it's a very good system, the system that we have, from Scripture about suing people and taking them to the courts and taking them to judges. We should be doing those things, and that's a great way to enforce laws and to protect people and love your neighbor. But there does need to be proper procedures and boundaries and things like that too.
Yeah, because I feel like I'd love to have a situation where if I have a problem with someone, I don't immediately go to a lawsuit. I
Right.
would love there to be some steps in between. It feels like the automatic reaction to anyone for any kind of malpractice or anything like that is just how about sue you. So yeah, maybe that's just it's the only way at the moment, given the secularity of our culture, to solve the problem of malpractice, or other harms being done to these people. But I don't know. It feels like it's not slowing down, and I'd really like it to slow down. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how we do that.
Well, it's like a lot of things, when people don't govern themselves, then you're going to have a lot more laws and you're a lot more lawsuits. And so
Yeah,
the
that's
way
true.
to deal with it is, um, a reformation of our culture, and that's what it takes. You're always going to have lawsuits, just like you're always going to have crimes, criminal prosecutions.
Right.
But yeah, we should be way better than we are at settling things, at people admitting, hey, I've done wrong. Here you go. Here's some money to cover it, and people who are willing to say, what, nah, you didn't really do me wrong. That was my fault too, right? Whenever we're, you know, an immoral society, then we're going to see a breakdown there.
Yeah, I think we're a responsibility abdicating society, and also we are um, kind of we are not an honest society either. That's
Right.
certainly become clear in the past since COVID, kind of. So all of that remains in the preacher's hands to solve, and in God's hands. So I don't know that I might start buying billboards and saying, "Don't sue them, just talk it out." But I don't know that that's going to cause too much of a revolution in this country.
Right. Probably not.
Probably not.
There are
Worth a
some there
shot
are some
though.
solutions I think that'd be helpful, but I don't know how helpful that one would be.
Yeah. What other solutions are there?
Well, I mean, I think you got to the core of it, which is, we need faithful pastors and preachers, preaching God's law, and preaching love, and settling with, on the way to court, like Jesus even talked about.
Yeah.
So that's fundamentally where it's at. It's fundamentally, we have dissensions and we have lawsuits because we have strife in our hearts, and so that's where we need to repent first and foremost. But then, yeah, then there's other areas of the law that we could improve to make things more just.
Yeah, and also perhaps more. Well, I don't know if I want to say more difficult because I do want the person who is the farmer to be able to go to court with the big company that screwed him over. So anyway,
Right.
that's a problem for another day. Where can people find you and your work with Heritage Defense and also the Foundation to Abolish Abortion and all of the other things that you are doing online?
Yeah, they can find me on X at Bradley Pierce, and they can check Heritage Defense out at heritagedefense.org, or the Foundation to Abolish Abortion at faa.life. And both of those are also on all the socials as well. And so you can check them out there.
Fantastic. Any other things you want to promote? Upcoming events, upcoming works, things in the works?
Nothing right now. One thing that we've done, not too long ago, was produce a documentary called "Abortion Free," that really is
Hmm.
to help people understand where the kind of anti-abortion movement is at after Dobbs, both the pro-life and the abolitionists. And so it's a six-part docu-series, like 25, 30-minute episodes, very digestible. And hopefully, I think it's entertaining. You know, it's a neat story. It's not just like a talking head thing, but you can check that out at abortionfree.com. It's all free, or you can go to our YouTube channel, Foundation to Abolish Abortion, and check it out there.
Fantastic. And what can people who, people like myself who, I haven't had an abortion or haven't had anyone in my life have an abortion and I don't have hands on the levers of power do to kind of help in this cause to fight this evil?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, supporting organizations who are doing good work, you can do that with your finances, and then in your own state, when there's bills that come up, abolition bills, equal protection bills in your state, to get behind them, contact your legislator, email them, call them. It takes 5 minutes to do either one of those. Just let them know this is what you want, and that's a good start.
Fantastic. I'll put as many links as I can in the description. Bradley, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. Thanks.
See you guys.